HP Lion Roar PT5. Three pops broke the sweet serene silence of the forest outside Godric's Hollow. Remus Lupin, along with Tonks and Bill Weasley, quickly scanned their surroundings to make sure they had not just operated into a trap. When they were sure they were alone, Remus waved the other two to follow him. Remus was the only one who'd ever been to this quiet little village before, and that hadn't been in many years. Yet, he remembered the way as if he'd been there that morning. As he had so many times, he chose to approach the house from behind. The forest provided excellent cover, and as the group approached the house, Remus halted them in order to make sure they were not about to walk into their enemy's hands. Tonks cast the revealing spell, and, just as they were told, there was only one human being glowing red through the walls of the battered old house. Sitting on the second floor, just as was planned. Remus sniffed the air, and recognized the scent at once. A little of his tension melted and he very slowly approached the broken-down house. Bill followed, with Tonks covering them from the rear. Remus was overcome with emotion the moment he touched the doorknob. A flood of memories washed over him, and he had to stop for a moment to collect himself. Memories of sipping tea while he and Lily watched baby Harry crawl across the garden chasing after a butterfly. Or enjoying another wonderful meal, as Sirius and James debating which Quidditch team was superior. Remus. Tonks asked softly, her small hand touching his cheek. Are you all right? Lupin nodded softly and took a deep calming breath before opening the door. He'd never seen the results of that night. He'd never been able to face it. It was something he had always hated about himself, but he had lived with his guilt so long, it barely registered anymore. But the moment he stepped through the kitchen, which looked untouched, tears filled his eyes. The sitting room was blackened, and as he looked up, he could see into what had once been a guest room, and the blue sky beyond. It looked far worse than he'd ever imagined, as at least part of the house had been blown apart. Lupin felt Tonks slip her hand inside his and gave a reassuring squeeze. Come on, Wolfie. He's waiting for us. Tonks smiled, rubbing her lover's arm. Lupin nodded again, took another deep calming breath and led the group up the shaky stairs to the second level. Wands at the ready, they followed Remus through the hall. He led the way into a large room that had once been James and Lily's bedroom. Where is he? Bill asked. We know he's here. Tonks said, looking confused. Maybe I should cast. Bill was suddenly thrown forward, crashing over the broken-down bed. Tonks spun on her heel, but quickly found herself upside down, her hands bound, her wand on the floor. Remus shot a spell back through the door, but they only smashed into the wall. Before he could fire another spell, Remus' nose twitched, and he paused. He started to call out, when he found himself bound, and on the floor. Remus? Tonks asked, a bit of fear in her voice. She tried to free herself and get her wand before they were killed. Someone stepped into the room, and Tonks turned as best she could and watched in rapt attention as someone disillusioned themselves. How have you guys gotten so slow? Harry Potter asked, a small smile on his face. He aimed his wand at Remus, kneeling down so he was close to the werewolf. Okay, what was the first thing you ever said to me? Harry said, digging his wand into Remus' neck a bit. I believe I offered you chocolate, as you had just fainted after meeting your first Dementor. Remus said calmly. Harry's smile broadened and he freed Remus at once, handing the man his wand back. If I may say so, your spell work is a little weak. Remus said, going to Bill Weasley to revive him. I've been a bit under the weather. In fact, Daphne's very upset that I left, but I was the only one who knew where the house was. Harry admitted, letting Tonks down gently. How'd you take us by surprise? She asked. I knew you'd use the revealing spell, so I stayed in this room until I knew you were in the house, then I went into the bathroom there," Harry said, pointing to the open door behind Tonks. "A simple disillusionment, and silencing charm and a lot of patience." Harry shrugged. "What happened?" Bill Weasley asked, sitting up with Remus' help. "Harry got the drop on us," Remus said proudly. "Good on you, mate," Bill said, getting to his feet. "What now?" Tonks asked. "We got to get out of here. There are constantly Death Eaters in the village and I don't know how closely they watch this place," Harry said quickly. Tonks noted his face paling, but decided now was not the time for questions. Harry pulled a rusted-looking door knocker out of his pocket and held it up for the others to touch. At once they four of them were swept away by the porte-cochere and landed in a lovely, though overgrown garden. "Welcome to Chateau Dumbledore," a very cheerful voice said. "Hermione!" Tonks shouted with glee as she swept the girl up in a huge hug. "And Daphne, too." Tonks had been the one in charge of training last summer, and had not seen her prodigies since they had returned to school. Hugging each girl twice in turn, Tonks felt extremely overjoyed to see the girls again, and was looking forward to what she hoped would be some very juicy talk later on. "Did she say Dumbledore?" Bill asked as he watched Tonks take both Hermione and Daphne by the arm and lead them into the house. "She did. This was Dumbledore's home before he died. He left it to me for the war. We're very protected here. We even spent a few weeks saying his name before we even knew it was tabooed. No one ever found us." Harry smiled as he took a chair in the sitting room. Remus noticed how pale and sweaty he looked. Dobby came running in with a mug of something, which Harry drained before making a disgusted face. "Professor Lupin." Neville smiled as he greeted the man. "Neville, good to see you." "And you as well. I take it things went well?" Neville asked, looking at Harry, who was looking a bit shaky. "Up until Harry ambushed us." Bill smiled, shaking Neville's hand. "That was my idea." Neville chuckled. "Just to make sure it wasn't a trap. We've all gotten a bit paranoid over the past month or so. We noticed your grandmother has gone missing, Neville." Remus started. Neville waved off the man's concerns. "That was our doing. We needed some information from her, and in going to her, we more or less signed her death warrant. She made for the mainland that day. I just got a letter from her this morning and she's rather enjoying being abroad. It's been quite long time since she's had a vacation. So then she's safe." Remus sighed with relief. "Honestly, I'd be more concerned for any Death Eater who tried to take her down. There's good reason why I'm still scared of her. She's not one to go easy on anyone who tries to get one over on her." "Harry, you look really sick," Bill said, drawing everyone's attention. "What happened?" "It was my fault, I'm afraid," Daphne said as she, Hermione and Tonks reappeared. "Daphne, we discussed this. We're all to blame." Hermione tried. She and Daphne had patched things up between them, and Hermione had admitted to being partially to blame for events that led to the disastrous visit to Greengrass Manor. Harry and Neville suspected she felt quite guilty for smacking Daphne when they had returned. "Lestrange managed to poison Harry with draught of living death," Hermione said in her lecturing voice. "It took us a couple of weeks to brew an antidote, but we managed it in the end. Harry's still not fully recovered, but he's getting better. There was only so much we could do here, and it was extremely difficult getting some of the ingredients." "How long were you under?" Tonks asked, a hint of fright in her tone. "It was getting close to 3 weeks," Daphne said, going to Harry's side. He shouldn't be out of bed yet, but he was the only one to have visited his parents' home. Remus sighed, shaking his head. A stupid risk. We needed to regroup with the order. Harry said weakly, his eyelids drooping a bit. We're close to the end, but we can't do it alone. We've been working on a few plans, and with the Order's help, we can cripple the Death Eater's forces, and maybe manage to open Hogwarts. At least we might make it possible to free some of the students. What? How? Tonks asked as she sat next to Remus, who was staring flabbergasted at the young man before him. What do you know that we don't? Later. Daphne said forcefully. There'll be plenty of time to talk later. Right now, Harry needs to rest. He's overexerted himself. You stupid git. I still say you're channeling Pomfret. Harry smiled weakly as Daphne helped him to his feet. He kissed her cheek softly, and even though she was clearly upset by his weakened condition, she smiled softly. Keep it up, mister, and I start channeling Snape. Everyone heard Harry's moan of disgust as Daphne led Harry away, and chuckled. Like James and Lily. Remus whispered, and Tonks gave his arm a squeeze. Sirius is going to be incredibly happy to see him. To see all of you. Tonks smiled at Hermione and Neville. We should contact them, and let them know we made it. Bill said, making for the fireplace. Bill. Hermione said, stopping the redhead. We're not connected to the Flug. Otherwise we would have had you all come directly here. Bill blanched and then smiled. Right. Hermione ducked out of the sitting room, and returned a few minutes later with Daphne and the hand mirror. Remus took the mirror and called out Sirius' name. Remus, you found them. How are they? Where's Harry? Calm down, everything's fine. We met up with Harry and the others, and they're all in fairly good condition. Harry's been put to bed, as he's still recovering from being poisoned, but don't worry, he's doing well. Poisoned? What happened? I don't have all the details, but I'm sure we'll hear all about it soon enough. For now, we're all safe, and I'll be bringing everyone back tomorrow. Let everyone know that Harry and the others are doing just fine, and they'll see them tomorrow, just as soon as we can manage it. All right. Look after them, Remus. You know I will. Remus smiled, and a moment later, his best friend's face disappeared. Well, since we have some time to kill, why don't you lot tell us what you've been up to? Bill smiled. Oh no. Neville smiled. And Hermione sat down next to him, crossing her legs demurely. Neville's right. We're not going to tell you all we've done, only to repeat the tale tomorrow. She took Neville's hand and watched Daphne take a seat, looking anxious. No doubt she was still worried about Harry, who had very stupidly chosen to go alone that day, despite all the protests from the rest of them. Why don't you let us know what you've been up to? It was still dark out and the clock had only just chimed 5 in the morning when Sirius extricated himself from his blankets and set about finding clean clothes. He had slept quite peaceful, but his excitement at welcoming his godson home had awoken him much sooner than he normally would have risen. Sirius finished dressing himself and was about to open his bedroom door when a voice stopped him. Where are you going? Sirius turned towards the bed, where Amelia was sitting up, the sheets held to her chest, her hair a tangled mess falling into her softly smiling face. She was looking at him with concern as she spoke. He won't be here for another couple of hours, you know. I know. Sirius smiled as he went to her side and sat down. I'm just excited to see your godson is alive and well. Amelia offered, taking his hand. He raised it to his lips and kissed her knuckles lovingly. Her smile softened and she used her other hand to play with his jet black locks. He's been fighting so hard, I know he has, and I feel like we're about to let him down. We've done virtually nothing. I'm ashamed of myself, really. Sirius sighed as he stared at the interlocked hands. I know. Amelia said, trying to pull Sirius closer. But getting up before the sun, and pacing about the house or whatever else you were thinking of doing is not going to change anything. He's proud of you, even if we've done nothing. He'll be happy that you're alive, and that's what's important. Once we're all together, we can figure out exactly what we need to do. Sirius nodded, knowing that she was right, of course. She always was. Still, Sirius could not stop feeling eager or anxious to see Harry once again. For nearly 3 months now, he'd been in the dark about Harry's whereabouts, and it had kept him awake many nights with worry. In fact, if Amelia hadn't worn him out so completely the night before, he knew he would have been awake watching for Harry, Remus, and the others to arrive. In the meantime, Amelia smirked, allowing the sheets to fall from her chest, and tugging Sirius further onto the bed. I think we can come up with something a little more productive for you to do until Harry arrives. I don't really fancy hearing my godson's name while you're in this state of undress. Sirius grinned. Sirius, shut up and take off your clothes. Astoria sat in the bedroom she shared with Tracy, Susan Bones, and her best friend Gretchen. Both Susan and Gretchen were asleep, and Astoria was fairly sure Tracy was asleep as well, but she never could tell with that girl. Susan's breathing was very deep and peaceful, while Gretchen had the daintiest of snores. Tracy's breathing, on the other hand, was so light, one could mistake her for dead if they weren't really listening. Astoria looked over to Tracy's bed and saw that the blonde was laying on her side, eyes closed, one hand under her pillow supporting her head, the other clutching the blankets softly. Over the last few months, Astoria had tried to figure out a way to tell if Tracy were awake or not. Several times when she thought everyone was asleep, Astoria would allow herself time to cry silently. Every one of those times, Tracy had surprised her by being awake, and comforted her. It had always embarrassed her, because she had felt it was a weakness to cry. She could never explain why she felt that way, however. And so, she had begun her quest to figure out Tracy's tells. So far, she had nothing. Tori turned back to the window to watch the sun rise over the ocean. Since she had come to the island, she had not missed a single sunrise or sunset. It had started the first morning she had awoken there, long before anyone else. She had been scared, and overwhelmed by all that had happened in her escape from Hogwarts. She had found it settling, in many ways. She hadn't intended to repeat it the next day, but before she realized it, she was waking up every morning before dawn and watching the sun rise over the sea, signaling the beginning of a new day. Every night, she made her way, usually alone, to watch it set again. As she would watch the last rays fade away, she would whisper a silent prayer to be with her family once again. Toady, she was getting part of that prayer answered. Daphne was not only alive, but she was coming to the island. It had been horrible not knowing if her sister was alive, especially knowing that she was with Harry, fighting against the Death Eaters. She knew she shouldn't really worry. Daphne was exceptionally well trained, if any of her spell work last year was an indication. On top of that, she was a Slytherin, and she wasn't about to going charging into battle, wand blazing. On the other hand, Daphne was in love with Harry Potter, who was the epitome of a Gryffindor. She's not going to get here any faster because you're staring out the window. Tracy's soft sleepy whisper cut the silence. Tori jumped slightly, and scowled at Tracy. I knew you weren't asleep. Tori hissed. Sure you did. Tracy smiled, though her eye remained shut. How long have you been awake? Feels like most of the night, actually. Tori sighed, turning back to the sunrise. The first rays were only now appearing over the horizon. You. I don't think I slept at all. If your snores are any clue, you were out most of the night. Tori said flatly, but Tracy scoffed. They would be if I snored. Tracy remarked. How anyone in your dorm managed to sleep through your obnoxious ground-shaking snores is beyond reason. I do not snore. Astoria shrieked. Tracy shushed her, raising her hand to point to where Susan stirred. Gretchen hadn't moved at all, her gently girlish snores continuing uninterrupted. I do not snore. Tori repeated in a low hissing whisper. Just keep telling yourself that. Tracy smiled. She finally opened her eyes to look out the pouting Astoria, a grin splitting her face. She sat up, swinging her legs out of her bed, and stretched, yawning a bit. It's just so surreal, you know. I mean, I've been wondering all this time what she's been doing, and now, I'm finally going to see her again. I'm going to find out what she's been up to. Astoria smiled lightly. Mostly I'm anxious to find out if she and Harry have done the deed. Tracy smiled, and Astoria tried to stifle her laughter. Like I told you two already. Susan said sleepily. There is no way that they have been together as long as they have, hidden away from the world and not gotten physical. Both girls turned and saw Susan sitting up in her bed. Her red hair was a mess, and she did her best to brush it out of her face. The topic of Harry and Daphne's physical relationship had come up quite a lot between the four girls in this particular bedroom. They would all stay up quite late into the night discussing Harry's attributes, and what the two might have experimented with. Tracy had never imagined Susan Bones possessing quite such a dirty mind. Susan had confessed that she thought Tracy was far more experienced than she actually was. Over the past few months, these four girls had formed a tight bond, especially given they were the only four girls of their age on the island, and with no boys of appropriate age to even flirt with. They had to make do. Tracy and Susan, being closer in age than Astoria was, had formed a very close bond, and Astoria wondered sometimes when the two went off on their own, if some experimenting might be going on. If she had been younger, she might have tried to follow them and see what they were getting up to. Now she had matured, and she respected their privacy too much to even ask about it. But she was almost certain. I'm willing to bet they're shagging as we speak. One last romp before they have to leave their secret hideaway and rejoin the world. Susan snickered. And what, pray tell, might they be doing during this highly charged sexually escapade? Tracy grinned, while Susan extracted herself from her blankets. No. Tori said, waving her hands. Not now, please. I don't need those kind of images floating in my head when I see my sister. After all the speculation we've done in this room, I don't think you're going to have a choice. Tracy sniggered. Great. Tori sighed, getting out of her own bed and going to the bathroom to get washed. When the door closed, Susan looked at Tracy, who gave a soft smile. I've been wondering. Susan began shyly. She looked up into Tracy's eyes and took a calming breath, brushing a few strands of brilliant red hair behind her left ear. Are you going to tell her? You know. About us? Tracy asked, her smile widening. Of course I'm going to tell her. Daphne's my best friend, and all she wants is to see me happy. She might be a little taken aback by everything, but she'll be supportive. She's always been there for me, and this will be no different. I'm still not sure about any of this. Susan shrugged. I've never even thought about this sort of thing before you and I. How many times have we talked about this, dot. Tracy smiled sweetly. We've said it from the very beginning that we don't know what this is or if it will last. We're two friends comforting one another. We swore that for now, there'd be as few complications as we could manage. We did. Susan nodded. But every time we are close, I feel like I want more with you. It's hard to explain. Then it's a good thing I know what you're talking about. Tracy nodded. You're amazing, and I know that no matter what happens, I will not ever have any regrets about what we've had. But I promised you that if anything changes, I will tell you. And if you don't want to go on, then that's it. We will part ways as friends. Susan smiled and nodded. A very special friend. It was just after breakfast when Sirius felt the ward's flare. His sudden exodus from the Flamel house seemed to jolt everyone else into action and they all followed him. Quickly he went out to the front porch, with nearly every occupant and a few visitors right behind him. He watched as one by one, the exiled reappeared along the beach path. Remus led them, with Tonks at his side, her hand in his. Right behind them was Harry and Daphne, with Neville and Hermione just behind, and Bill Weasley in the rear. At once the reverent silence was torn asunder by an overexcited shriek of delight, and Astoria Greengrass nearly knocking everyone over to run to her sister and leap into Daphne's open arms. Nearly everyone laughed as Daphne lost her balance, obviously forgetting that her sister was nearly as tall as she was. I can't believe you're here. Tori screamed as she held onto her sister. I'm so glad you're safe. Daphne replied. She isn't the only one. Daphne let go of her little sister and grabbed onto her best friend, who held her very tightly. Tears began to fall from Daphne's dark eyes, happy to see her lifelong friend alive and safe. Tracy's face was nearly a mirror image of her best friend's, and the two girls sniffled at the same time, which caused them to start laughing. While the Greengrass girls and Tracy were celebrating being reunited, Harry was now being welcomed by his godfather who was clutching him very tightly. Unable to speak due to the joyful lump that had formed in his throat, Harry simply held onto his godfather, unable to express his own happiness at having finally been reunited. Handshakes, backpats, warm hugs and impassioned words of greeting were shared between the newcomers and the refugees of the Flamel house. After a bit, everyone went back inside and made themselves comfortable and Harry, Neville, Hermione and Daphne were pelted with questions about all they had been up to. The 4 teens did their best to relate all they had done and learned in the past few months, before turning the tables and questioning Amelia and the Order about their time. Amelia was most apologetic when she explained that they had done very little and that the Order was spread out now, hardly daring to contact one another as most everyone was under surveillance now. We've had our hands tied pretty tightly since Hogwarts was overrun. Most of our people have children on the inside, and are too afraid to do anything for fear that the Death Eaters might take retribution. So long as the children are trapped at the school, there's not a lot we can do. Tonks offered. Well then, it's a good thing we finally managed to make contact. Harry said, looking at everyone. We've come up with a plan. It would have taken a lot longer with just the 4 of us, but I think we can make it even more effective, and do it all at once now. What are you talking about, Harry? Arthur Weasley asked. He wasn't the only one to look interested. We want to use his name to trigger ambushes. Neville smiled, looking over at Harry, who nodded. We had thought about repeating it over and over again, but if I'm thinking the same as Harry, we set up a bunch of locations and at an appointed time. We say the name, forcing his followers to come attack whoever was foolish enough to invoke his wrath. Amelia said, standing up, looking thoughtful. This could work. If we set enough ambushes, we could effectively cripple their forces. Bill Weasley smiled, squeezing Fleur's hand as she rubbed his arm affectionately. This is a massive undertaking, Remus pointed out. But it has a good chance of success, Mad-Eye Moody replied. They only send 4, maybe 5 out for each utterance. We set up traps with 6 to 8 of our forces and incapacitate them. We kill them, Harry said flatly. Harry, Mrs. Weasley said in horror. Surely you can't mean. I do, Mrs. Weasley, Harry said, looking the woman in the eye, before turning to look at them all in turn. We don't give them a chance to regroup, or revive their mates. We don't give them the opportunity to return and kill us. We've been playing soft, and they've taken advantage of our mercies. No more. If we're going to win this war, win our freedom back, then we have to kill them. As awful as it is, we have no other choice. Boy finally grew a backbone, Moody mumbled, and Harry gave a small nod to the former orator. But we're not executioners, Molly Weasley tried. Hermione spoke up for the first time, looking directly at Mrs. Weasley. Would you stand by and let a Death Eater kill your husband, or one of your children? Would you simply stand by and watch them be killed, or would you do whatever it took to ensure the safety of your family? Mrs. Weasley stared in horror at Hermione as her words sunk in. Slowly, the horror melted into sadness and she slowly nodded. I would kill anyone who tried to hurt my family, she admitted softly. War is ugly, and cruel, Hermione continued. But we're fighting for the safety of our children, Mrs. Weasley muttered. And their children. Amelia smiled, looking at Susan across the room, who smiled in return. Then we have a lot of work to do, Moody barked. That we have. Amelia nodded. Moody, Tonks, Remus, Bill, I think it's time to try and re-establish contact with our friends. With quick nods, the 4 quickly left, all bidding farewells to Harry and his friends. Sirius, Harry said quietly as conversations broke out. I need to ask you about your brother. So, you guys have been busy, Tracy commented as she and her best friend headed out of the bustling Flamel house and out to the beach. Daphne felt quite relaxed for the first time since before the war had truly broken out. She'd been cooped up in Dumbledore's house with the same 3 people, and as much as she loved them, she was thankful for a break, especially since she was with Tracy once again. Being back on this beach where she and Harry had grown so close during the last summer, and had only just begun to discover the intimacy between them, brought a sad smile to her face. While they had grown quite close, their time together had seemed hurried in some ways. She wondered if it was just her perception, or if the war had gotten so deep into their psyches that they felt they needed to rush through their lovemaking. She felt it best to ask Harry about it later, when he felt better. I'm starting to think I was very lucky not to be with you all. I've been here thinking you guys needed me or something, and it turns out you were all perfectly fine on your own, Tracy said, breaking Daphne out of her thoughts. Not as much as you think. The last time we did anything, well, it didn't turn out so good, Daphne sighed. Tracy cocked her head and wrapped an arm around her friend. I nearly lost everything because I was stupid. I'm sure you did fine. I'm the reason Harry's not doing so great right now, Daphne said heavily. I was an idiot. Her eyes drifted to the shoreline where the waves crashed against the shore. She could feel her tension melting away a bit as she watched and listened to the ocean's roar. She felt at peace here the summer before, and once again as she walked the sandy shore with Tracy. Perhaps Harry would consider getting a house on the coast when they were married. Once again, Tracy interrupted her thoughts. Typical Daphne. One mistake and you let it rule your life for the next year. You remember that botched test in second year? You nearly studied yourself to death, and, may I add, nearly got petrified. I did not. Daphne huffed. I was never anywhere close to where that thing was. That you know of. Remember Harry said it was using the plumbing. Tracy reminded her friend. How did you guys end up here anyway? Daphne asked, changing the subject. I thought for sure you guys were dead. When I got the letter from my mum that told me Tori was alive, I hoped you had made it too, but... To be honest, I almost didn't make it. Tracy shuddered. I was in really bad shape by the time we managed to escape. Then it got worse. What do you mean? Well, when we got separated. We've got to get to Dumbledore's office, now. Daphne screamed as she pulled Hermione back through the passageway they had just come from. Tracy took hold of Tabby, while Astoria helped her friend Gretchen. They hurried back up the stairs following Hermione's lead as fast as they could until they re-emerged into the fourth-floor corridor. This way! Hermione shouted as she sprinted holding onto the Daphne's arm. They followed the Gryffindor through passages, upstairs, downstairs through secret doors until they emerged into a long corridor that Tracy recognized. But she was now thoroughly confused where she was. Then the world spun as a large section of wall exploded, and a large column fell, blocking their path and effectively separating them from Hermione and Daphne. Several large chunks of ceiling crashed down, creating a thick curtain of dust that stung their eyes and choked their lungs. Tori. Tracy knew that Daphne was coming back for them. Make her stop. Astoria said quickly. If she's caught, Harry will get himself killed trying to save her. The younger Greengrass was helping her friend back to her feet, and pulling her wand, searching for signs of their saboteurs. Get going. Tracy shouted, fighting to keep from coughing. We're right behind you. Just go. We're not leaving without you. Hermione said. Bombarda. The floor in front of Tracy exploded, knocking Tracy and Tabby off their feet. Tracy felt Tabby land on her chest, knocking the wind out of her. Tracy heard footsteps and something that sounded like a loud smack. Tracy did her best to suck in a breath and shouted for Hermione and Daphne to run away, just as several spells flew over her, creating strange effects in the dust cloud. Tracy heard Daphne, sounding much closer, scream her refusal to leave Tracy or Astoria behind. Daphne, go. Astoria screamed from somewhere deep in the rubble and confusion. Tracy felt her heartbeat quicken as she realized that she would not be meeting up with Daphne at Dumbledore's office. She would not ever see her mother again, or get the chance to fall in love. She was about to die. But she was not going to die alone. Pushing Tabby's limp form off of her chest, Tracy gripped her wand tightly, and thought of the most painful spell she had ever learned. Something that would kill any Death Eaters who attempted to kill her. She had thought of this spell often since Sirius Black had explained to her and her friends last summer how it was supposed to work. Splintering every bone in an adversary's body, possibly piercing the heart, lungs, and other vital organs. The hand practiced on pig carcasses only once, and all three girls had spent the night nursing serious nausea. But today, as her own death was slowly creeping to take her, Tracy lifted her head high as she raised her wand. As several shadows became clear in the settling dust, she beckoned to Astoria and Gretchen behind her, and once they were out of the line of fire, let loose. Fractus Skeletus. The first Death Eater screamed as the spell hit him dead center in his chest. He was thrown back, and after only a few seconds, his screams were silenced. His comrade was far luckier, as he was able to get a shield up in time. He returned fire, a simple stunning spell that Tracy dodged fairly easily. She was only just starting to question why the Death Eaters were using such weak spells. Astoria could cast something stronger than what the Death Eaters were throwing at them. That's when she noticed a few more shadows in the dust. She then realized that she was horribly outnumbered. She prayed that it would be quick, and that it wouldn't hurt. Just as Tracy was beginning to accept her fate, there was another explosion, and a new cloud of dust, once again choking them. Tracy felt a firm hand on her shoulder, spinning her around. Her wand went up as she screamed, but her hand was caught and she found herself staring into the cold black eyes of Severus Snape. "What do you think you are doing? You were supposed to go to the headmaster's office." "We were trying, we got separated," Tracy shouted. "We have to move. Follow me." Snape waved them to follow him down the passage he had emerged from. Tracy bent to collect Tabby when Snape stopped him. "Do not bother with her, she is dead." Tracy was taken aback by the teacher's cold indifference, but knew that now was not the time to bother with it. She glanced to see that Astoria, along with her friend Gretchen, who was sniffling and wiping at her terrified eyes, were already behind Snape, and she got to her feet and began to follow herself. Then something hit her back, knocking the wind out of her and sending her sprawling across the floor. At first, the world spun, and Tracy had no idea how she had ended wound up face down in dust and rubble. Then, a new sensation began to creep along her spine and up into her brain. It was as if someone had ripped all the nerve endings out of her back and put them over an open flame. It was surreal. She had thought death would be peaceful, quick. But all she felt was an intense agony that made her lose all self-control. Tears stung her eyes, and her fists clenched as she screamed out. She tried to get her legs under her, and get on her feet again, but her body simply refused to cooperate with her. Her skin felt like it was being held over a very hot fire. There was a warm stickiness sliding down her pants and into her knickers. She felt herself being hefted up on someone's shoulder, and she fought to remain conscious. She could see Tori and Gretchen following right behind, and she heard Tori begging her to stay awake. She desperately wanted to know what she'd been hit with, and how bad it was, but her own fear kept her from asking, or trying to investigate. She glanced up and could see shadowy figures trying to come after them, fighting rubble and dust to get a clear shot off. Trixie, weak as she felt, wasn't about to go down without more of a fight. Raising her wand, she did her best to take aim and fired off 2 spells. She knew that the Artiopenitus hit its target if the choking, gasping, and cries of panic and terror were any indication. One Death Eater was painfully burning to death from the inside out. Sirius Black would be most proud of her. Halls and passages passed her in blurs, and Tracy thought for sure she was going to vomit, or die, or both. It all stopped suddenly and Tracy felt herself being laid upon something hard, and Call-used fingers probing her back. Every manipulation sent long waves of intense pain up her spine. "Thank the gods your spine is intact," Snape said. She couldn't see his face, but she heard a bit of relief in his somber voice. His tone actually frightened her about the severity of her wounds. "Though, there will be no preventing the scars. Petrificus totalis." Tracy felt her body stiffen, but could still feel the overwhelming pain that gripped her unmercilessly. "That should keep any further damage until you can be treated," Snape said as he stepped away. Tracy saw Astoria kneel before her, and felt her wipe at her face. The youngest green grass was crying as well as she touched Tracy's face. "You're going to be okay." Tori smiled, tears falling down her face. Tracy was struck by how much Tori looked like Daphne had in their 3rd year. She even sounded like Daphne in some ways. Perhaps it was just her mind trying to make sense of everything that was happening to her body. Astoria rose and disappeared from Tracy's view, and then she felt herself being lifted once again. Tell them the school is lost, the ministry as well, and that they should hide until I can get word. Snape said, and Tracy felt the gentle warmth of the fire. She now saw Snape, his face grave, as he threw a handful of flux powder into the flame. She had never seen the normally sullen man look so grave. Then, the world began to spin and she, along with Astoria and Gretchen, were being whisked away in the flug. She didn't recognize the place they fell out at, but she heard a lot of panicked voices, including Astoria screaming for help. She felt herself being lifted up again, though this time she didn't feel anyone's hands or arms, so she guessed she had been levitated. Then she caught sight of Mad-Eye Moody, and she felt relief wash over her. They were safe. They had been sent to the Order of the Phoenix. Don't release her. She's been hurt really bad. Astoria was screaming. Tracy heard other voices and gasps of horror as she was laid on the table on her stomach, just as she'd been in Snape's office only a moment ago. Moody stomped out and Tracy heard him call for Sirius. A few seconds later, Sirius Black, Harry Potter's godfather, appeared in her field of vision, looking terribly grim. Tracy, we're going to release you. Do your very best not to move. As soon as we release you, Molly's going to pour something on your wounds, and it's really, really going to hurt. If you don't stay as still as possible, it could make things worse. We're going to hold you down to help. Just try and stay still. Tracy tried to convey that she understood with her eyes, and hoped he got the message. All at once she felt her limbs relax and she could blink once again. Hands were holding her at every angle, and then she felt something cold on her back. At first it felt wonderful, given that her flesh had felt like it was on fire, but then, it felt like millions of insects were biting and stinging her. It felt like she'd been dipped in acid. Tracy's head shot up and a hellish scream filled her throat, shaking the entire house on its foundation. It's going to be all right, Tracy. Don't fight it. Sirius shouted into her ear. Tracy kept screaming as the pain intensified. She was fighting the people holding her down. She needed to get away, needed to escape the pain. You're killing her. Astoria screamed, and someone else told the young green grass to stay out of the way. Tracy tried to breathe as her lungs were now burning for air, but the pain was so intense that she could not stop shrieking. And then, mercifully, she passed out altogether. When I woke up, I was back in our room here on the island. Tracy turned and lifted the back of her shirt and Daphne saw two large purple scars. The largest was oblong, reaching from her left shoulder blade down to her waist. The second was more egg-shaped just under her right shoulder and stretching to the middle of her back on the right side. They think it was just a bum arta, but no one is certain. Everyone says I was very lucky it missed my spine, though I gather it was incredibly close. I spent 2 months in bed on some of the nastiest potions ever, but finally I was allowed to get up and roam the island. I'm so sorry. Daphne said tearily, and Tracy hugged her best friend. It isn't your fault. Tracy reminded. I can't believe you used that skeleton-shattering hex. Daphne shuddered. I still remember what happened to those pigs. It was the strongest spell I could think of. Tracy shrugged. It was them or me, and as it was, I was sure it was going to be them. I wasn't about to go quietly. But none of that compares to what's happened since. Daphne looked at Tracy's smile and felt that she was about to hear a very interesting story. She also felt it was going to be something romantic, as she could not remember Tracy smiling like this since she'd been crushing on Blaise Zabinai. Okay, who is it? She asked, a broadening smile on her face. Okay, see. The thing is, Tracy stammered and Daphne shook her head. No excuses. You found someone special and I'm excited for you. I want to know everything. Okay. Tracy said, taking a few deep calming breaths and faced her lifelong friend. We're not sure what it really is, and we've decided that it's best if we just allow things to develop. We've talked about it a lot and agreed that if things change, we'll part as friends and go our separate ways, hopefully remaining friends. After all, this isn't what most people would think is normal. Who cares what anyone else thinks, so long as you and he are happy? Now who is it? How'd it happen? Daphne pleaded and Tracy's face took on a rosy hue. We talked. We spent a lot of time together because we're the same age, and we just found we had a lot in common. It was the first time I got to go outside, and we walked out here on the beach and we were talking about all the things we missed and it led to talking about how much we both missed being kissed. And then, I don't know why, but she kissed me and it was really nice and I... Whoa, wait a minute. Did you say she? As in you and another girl? Daphne took an involuntary step back, staring incredulously at her blushing friend. Tracy nodded, avoiding Daphne's eyes. Daphne could only stare blankly at her best friend, her mouth agape, trying to digest this new piece of information. She tried once, twice, 3 times to speak, but all that came out was a strange strangled noise. Finally, Daphne took a long deep breath, hooked her arm through Tracy's, and began leading them along the beach again. She was shocked to say the least, but she was not about to judge anyone for their choices. And truthfully, she didn't care who it was that was stealing the heart of her best friend, so long as Tracy was happy. Well, I admit that I never imagined you would decide to play for the other team, she said finally, causing Tracy to grin. On the other hand, I should have guessed you were into girls. I mean, the amount of time you spent drooling over me and Hermione. Oh, shut it, you. I still like our team, she said. Though we can't all date Harry Potters and Neville Longbottoms. But Susan's great, and we've really bonded, you know? I mean, we've only just kissed a few times. I think we're both afraid of doing any more. But it isn't about that. Do you love her? Daphne asked seriously. I don't know. Tracy admitted. I doubt she knows what she really feels either. I mean, she likes boys too, which is why this is so strange. Honestly, I don't see it going the distance, not unless we found a bloke who doesn't mind sharing, I suppose. But it's nice, and comfortable. I like how she makes me feel. I'm happy for you. Just remember to be honest with yourself. There's no reason for both of you to get hurt because you're trying to make this into something it'll never be. Believe me, we've both discussed that at length. Tracy rolled her eyes. What about you? How are things between you and Harry? Have you guys finally cemented your relationship? If you're asking if we've had sex, then it's none of your business, and yes, we have nearly every night we were away. Daphne grinned maniacally, and Tracy threw her head back in laughter. It was truly wonderful to be together again, and Daphne knew that they had at last reached a turning point in the war, just as Harry said they would once they made contact with the Order. And they had good ideas where they could find the last of the Horcruxes. Things were beginning to unfold, and Daphne silently prayed that the end was near. It wasn't until quite late in the day when Harry was ready to talk at length with his godfather. Still recovering from the attack at Daphne's home, Harry had slept most of the day. This was a great improvement, as only the week before, he'd been asleep nearly every hour of the day. Sirius, along with Amelia Bones, Hermione, Daphne and Neville, settled themselves in the study along with Harry, who brought out the fake locket he'd retrieved with Dumbledore that night in the cave. and presented the tiny note they discovered inside. "You say you found this in a cave?" Sirius asked, looking gobsmacked. Harry nodded and Sirius reread the note before heaving a great sad sigh. "It's Regulus' handwriting, there's no doubt. He died only a few weeks before your parents, Harry. I had thought that he'd died fighting Aurors. I wasn't speaking to my mother any longer at that point, so I never knew exactly what happened to him." "When did you last talk to him?" Hermione asked, concern in her eyes as she watched Sirius' face. He looked stuck between anger and regret. "We all but ignored each other in school. He was in Slytherin and I was in Gryffindor. He was the good son, so far as my entire family was concerned, well except Andromeda. But, she married a Muggle, so it didn't matter what she thought. We spoke once after we were out of school. And it was only to posture, threaten each other. What's sad is that, before I went to Hogwarts, Reg and I were fairly close. Maybe if when I came home after that first year, and hadn't ignored him. Maybe. It may not have made any difference." Amelia said sadly, rubbing his arm. "I'll never know. But, this gives me hope that in the end, he realized that he'd been wrong to follow you-know-who. That my parents, with their vile hatred of Muggles and all that other pure-blood nonsense, were wrong. Not only that, but he actually may have tried to fight against him. Do you have any idea where he might have hidden the locket once he got it?" Sirius shook his head sadly and they all went quiet, each of them feeling somewhat defeated. But then Sirius perked up. "There might be a chance that someone else would know. If he's still alive, that is." "Who?" Hermione asked as everyone else leaned closer to Sirius in anticipation. "Our old house elf." "Creaker?" Harry asked, looking appalled. "That elf loved my brother, as if he were the damned thing's own child. Reg treated that elf like royalty. They were the best of friends, thick as thieves. Even my mother couldn't get the damn elf to work half as well as my brother. Can we call him, find out if he knew what happened to the locket?" Daphne asked, but Sirius shook his head. "I don't know. I don't even know if he's alive. He was terribly old when I was born. On top of that, we're under the Fidelius. And besides that, he was never too keen on doing what I asked of him." "Well, you treated him so terribly," Hermione remarked, huffing a bit. Sirius was about to retort but Amelia cut him off. "So we need to make a trip to your mum's house," she said, glaring at Sirius to hold his tongue. "At the very least we might be able to ask Creaker if he knows anything about the locket." "I don't think all of us should go," Sirius said flatly. "Harry and I can do this." "Now wait one damned minute," Daphne said, rising to her feet. "Why just the two of you?" "I have to agree," Amelia said. "We shouldn't all go, but I don't think it should just be you two. I know the place better than anyone, and Harry is still sick," Daphne snapped. "And if Death Eaters have managed to get inside your house, he won't be much use." "Hey, I'm right here, and I'm not dying. I'll be able to hold my own," Harry said, looking offended. "Enough," Neville shouted. "Bickering amongst ourselves isn't going to solve a damned thing. Nor is risking all of us," Amelia said quickly, looking at everyone in turn. "Now, Sirius will have to go, there's no question. He knows the house, and though the elf will be stubborn about it, he is still bound to serve Sirius." "I can find the locket if it's in the house," Harry said quickly. "Dumbledore trained me how to find all of these things. I'm sort of a divining rod for you-know-who's magic." "But you're still not fully recovered?" Hermione pointed out. Harry turned to glare at her, and she returned the look in kind. Children, enough. Amelia snapped. Fine, how about this? We wait a few days to let Harry re-cooperate a bit more. Then Harry and Neville go to Grimmauld Place and find out where this thing is. If it's in the house, they bring it back here straight away. This time she stared at Sirius, communicating her severe displeasure at the whole situation. Now you said there was another one of these things left. That one's going to be tricky, Neville said, rising from his seat. We're nearly certain that it's in the Lestrange vault in Gringotts. We can get it, but we need to kill Rudolphus Lestrange first. What do you mean? Amelia asked. Neville explained how his gran had registered a claim of reparation against House Lestrange. Both Amelia and Sirius perked up at this bit of news. As both the adults were from ancient houses, they were both familiar with the claims of reparation against wronged houses. Let me guess. Amelia smiled sadly. The goblins wouldn't allow her claim because Rudolphus was still alive. Neville nodded. Worse, Lestrange found out about her claim and challenged it. If he kills me, he'll get the entirety of the Longbottom fortune. I've never really paid much attention to the family finances, but I do know that we're quite rich. And if Lestrange gets his hands on your gold, Sirius began. He would undoubtedly give it all to his master in order to finance the end of the war. Hermione hurt him badly a few weeks ago, but we don't know if he was killed. Harry said, nodding at the bushy-haired witch, who was biting her lip in thought. I don't think he's dead, she said, staring into nothing. The goblins are nothing but efficient. Had he died, they would have contacted you at once. How do you know that? Harry asked. You fell asleep a lot during History of Magic, didn't you? Daphne asked, nudging Harry's shoulder. Everything you'd ever want to know about goblins is taught in that class. You just need to read between the lines a bit. It's part of the reason wizards entrusted their finances to the goblins. Despite all the mistrust between the two cultures, the one thing they usually agree on: gold. Hermione explained. No, if he were dead, we would know. She's right. Sirius nodded. So, we need to get him to come out of hiding. No one touches him but me, Neville said firmly, looking at everyone in turn. He's the last one remaining who's responsible for my parents' condition. I don't think you should worry about that, Amelia said flatly. After you killed both Bellatrix and Robespierre, nice job by the way, he'll be hunting you as well. Sirius smiled proudly, folding his arms over his chest. Which brings up another matter, Amelia said, shifting in her seat. Harry, your plan to set up ambushes is truly an inspired one, but... Well, while you slept, we got some responses from people. People are too afraid to fight anymore. We don't have the manpower we had hoped we might to be able to pull off a massive strike. And it's likely after pulling off an attack of this nature, you know who will likely remove the taboo from his name. Sirius pointed out. He'll pull in his forces and it'll be harder to end the war. Amelia nodded. If we don't do this just right, we may lose more than the war. He's still got an entire generation of witches and wizards in that castle. But if we do pull this off, Hermione began. It'll inspire others to rise up, won't it? I think it depends on how badly we cripple their forces. Sirius replied wisely. So basically what you're saying is that we need soldiers. Harry began smirking. Oh no. Daphne shook her head. He's got that look. What's on your mind, Harry? Sirius asked, his face beginning to mirror his godson's. I think it's time to write to Victor again. Harry chuckled. Wait, I thought he said Bulgaria wouldn't help us. Neville remarked, but Harry smiled even wider. Bulgaria as a country wouldn't get involved. But he was going to keep trying to rally people, and if a world-famous Quidditch star can't get people to help, then what good is it being a world-famous Quidditch star? I like the way this kid thinks. Amelia Bones grinned and playfully punched Sirius' arm. Please like and subscribe.